What were the fatal decisions that were made during the Everest tragedy? Did they underestimate the weather report, or was it the fault of the greed of commercial expeditions? In this report, we'll discuss that and many other topics. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay were the first to reach the top of the world, Mount Everest, in 1953. Since then, many climbers have followed in their footsteps with the goal of leaving their flags and names in history. It's also important to note that 1 in 4 high-altitude professionals lost against the mountain. Everything changed when, in 1992, the climber Rob Hall founded the first commercial expedition to the place, Adventure Consultants. Climbing the highest peak in the world was within reach of anyone who could pay for the services of Hall and Company, of course. By 1996, high mountain commercial expeditions were proliferating. Hundreds and thousands of clients without the necessary experience were summiting Everest every year. Many dreams came true. The previous season, they hadn't managed to reach the top, so summiting Everest in 1996 was crucial to secure more clientele in the following years. Rob Hall then joined Scott Fisher from Mountain Madness, and they agreed to work together and guide their clients in what they saw as a small window of time between approaching storms. But everything was chaos when May 10th of 1996 arrived, the day the Everest tragedy occurred. I would like you to tell me if you knew about the Everest tragedy, if you know what happened in this place, and if you saw the 2015 movie, which is about this tragedy. Any information you have will be more than welcome. I also invite you to leave suggestions for other possible videos of similar tragedies. Here's a trivia question. What's the height of Mount Everest? Leave your answers in the comments. Let's see who responds first. Let's get started. At 4:43 ante-meridium on May 11th, Rob Hall radioed base and reported that he was at the summit, south at 8,749 meters above sea level, in the so-called death zone, where literally a human being's cells die minute by minute. Being at 8,000 meters presents a body struggle against freezing temperatures and difficulty breathing due to the thinness of the atmosphere. Altitude sickness and hypoxia were the main enemies of the climber trapped between the summit of Everest and the storm. Hall reported that some of his clients were no longer with him. As if that wasn't enough, he was out of bottled oxygen reserves due to the regulator freezing. Not far from his exposition, other individuals were struggling to survive, facing what would end up being the worst experience of their lives. A dream adventure was turning into a complete hell, only a hell without flames, a hell where the absolute and deadly cold prevailed. Every second counted as if it were the last. Hal tried not to lose hope. He knew that staying calm was key in situations of those magnitudes. However, by 9 a.m., with frozen hands and feet, the man asked to speak with his wife, Jan Arnold, over the phone. He felt he had to say goodbye, but let's not get ahead of ourselves to know what happened after that call. We need to start from the beginning. Rob Hall and his partner and best friend Gary Ball were professional mountain climbers, and they set out to do the 7 summits in the span of 7 months. Such challenge is considered the greatest in mountaineering. Starting with Everest in May of 1990, they finished climbing the Vinson Massif in Antarctica in December of the same year. Hall and Ball realized that to maintain their sponsorships, their subsequent feats had to be more risky. So they decided to leave professional mountaineering and create Adventure Consultants in 1992, a company dedicated to high-altitude guided expeditions. Reaching the summit of Everest was no longer just an exclusive adventure for professional mountaineers. In the first year, Hall and his partners successfully took 6 clients to the summit without any complications. They soon became leaders among high mountain expeditions, but not all was good news for them. In 1993, Gary Ball suffered a high-altitude pulmonary edema that cost him his life. While that was a hard blow, Rob Hall continued with the business. He overcame depression, and in honor of his deceased colleague, he led Adventure Consultants to be the leading company in Everest expeditions. Despite having a higher price, Hall's reputation for reliability and safety attracted more customers than any other similar venture. Just as those who hired him climbed, so did his finances. Little by little, with each new daredevil that appeared in his offices, his bank accounts filled with more and more zeros. The most important competition for Hall was Mountain Madness, led by professional climber Scott Fisher, who had a completely opposite profile to Hall. Almost like a rock star, Fisher gave more importance to adventure than to safety. And both he and his main guide, the Russian Anatoly Bukrayev, climbed without the aid of oxygen tanks. Fisher especially appreciated the Russian, considering him one of the best, if not the best climber in the world. In case of danger, he trusted to be rescued by Anatoly. By 1996, Hall and Fisher had dozens of clients they had managed to take to the summit. Seeing the success of these ventures, more commercial expeditions opened up in search of capturing the market. So both pioneers, determined not to lose their privileged place, sought the attention of the press. John Krakauer, a journalist for Outside Magazine and accomplished climber, ended up signing up for one of Rob Hull's expeditions. The deal was that they would charge him less in exchange for a 5,000-word note, where the adventure would be narrated and potential clients would be urged to choose Rob's company. Fisher. He didn't sit idly by and went in search of Sandy Hill Pittman, a National Broadcasting Company reporter. The teams gradually came together. No one suspected they were on the eve of a terrible tragedy. History tells us that in the spring of 1996, between 15 and 20 expeditions were ready to begin the ascent to Everest. Hundreds of mostly inexperienced climbers are converging on the same routes and locations. It was a new record, but let's meet the protagonists of the two main expeditions, the ones that were at the center of the tragedy. Apart from Rob Hull, in adventure consultants were Mike Groom and Andy Harold Harris, who were the secondary guides. The 8 clients who would accompany them in that sadly famous season mostly had experience in ascents, but not in such risky adventures. Not to mention that many of them were not physically prepared for such a strain. Of these people, we are going to highlight 3 in particular. One is Yasuko Namba, 47 years old. Yasuko intended, upon reaching the summit of Everest, to become the second woman from Japan to climb the 7 summits. The other is Beck Weathers, 49 years old. Beck was going through a persistent depression which drove him away from his family in search of adventures in the heights. He didn't know that what he was about to experience would change his way of perceiving the world forever. Doug Hansen, on the other hand, was a 46-year-old man going through his second attempt to reach the top with Rob. The first time he hadn't succeeded, and as his financial situation didn't allow him a second chance, Hall had offered him a discount, claiming that he had grown fond of his story of persistence and sacrifice. Hansen was a mailman, and for his last chance to reach the top of Everest, he had mortgaged his house and received help from students at a school in Kent. These kids, along with a bundle of bills, had given him a flag to be able to place at the highest point in the world. The team was completed with a group of 6 Sherpas, led by Anne Dorsey. The Sherpas are an ethnic group inhabiting Nepal's Himalayan mountain regions. Due to their importance as guides, the term has been extended to any high mountain guide. On the other hand, there was Mountain Madness with the aforementioned Scott Fisher as the main guide. He had the also mentioned Anatoly and Neil Biddleman as secondary guides by his side. The clients of this expedition, unlike the one led by Hall, had more experience in high-altitude mountaineering. Lobsang Jambu was the lead Sherpa of the team. Among the other expeditions in the area, we can highlight a Taiwanese one, a Japanese one, and one from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. That human factor would cause bottlenecks and a much slower ascent, but that would not be the biggest problem. The weather report predicted a storm front for May 11th. For that reason, the 4 expeditions that were at Camp 4 wanted to reach the summit on the 10th and headed there at the same time. They wanted to beat the storm. Due to the large number of people on the way, they had to move in line along a thin area called South Ridge. The different expedition leaders discussed the matter and the competition for Colonel. The Everest deepened the disaster even more. Scott Fisher and Rob Hull decided to join forces and help each other, betting on a window of time between the forecasted storms. But the summit day had already begun poorly. The guide teams had forgotten to install fixed ropes in advance, which caused major delays in the ascent. They had to try to reach the summit within the optimal time frame, and that was at 1 o'clock. The ideal was to start the descent at 2 o'clock in daylight to reduce the danger. Avoiding the darkness of the night was fundamental on the icy peaks of Everest. On the morning of that day, the guide Anatoly set off ahead with his team, setting up the fixed ropes so that Hall and Fisher's teams, who were following closely, could continue. This resulted in a 2-hour delay for the ascent. 3 of the Adventure Consultants members began the descent before reaching the summit, when they began to suffer from altitude sickness. Beck Weathers suffered from altitude blindness, but refused to start the descent with the others, choosing to wait and descend with Rob Hull. By 1430, only 2 made the summit, the guide Anatoly and one of his clients, who had a record of having climbed the 7 summits. Noticing that things were not going according to plan, and sensing that something bad was about to happen, the Russian decided to descend alone to the camp, for to be in a better position and thus help the rest in the descent or in the imminent rescue. The other guide, Fisher's second, reached the summit with the rest of the Mountain Madness clients and began the descent, while Fisher himself was making his effort to climb. Despite health complications, he achieved his goal using 2 herbs found during his expedition. At 16 hours, the subject began the descent just as Yasu with Amba and Rob Hall arrived. As it became clear, they were already running against time, a 2-hour delay that meant imminent danger. This resulted in the use of extra oxygen tubes, and in a fatigue and exhaustion difficult to understand for those who have never been exposed to such cold and those details. When Hall began the descent, he encountered Doug Hansen, who tearfully asked for a chance to plant his flag. The one from the boys at Kent School, at the top of the world. Hall, who appreciated him, told himself that he couldn't let the mailman lose his second chance. So he helped him, leaving Namba in charge of one of his secondary guides. Hansen and Hall descended around 5 o'clock. By that time, the blizzards were hitting furiously. It was around that time when terror was unleashed on the climbers, located more than 8,000 meters high in the death zone. This place is known as the worst place in the world, because due to the terrible conditions, it is said that one dies a little bit, minute by minute. When the storm finally arrived, Hall was trapped in the pass. Hillary with his client Hansen, who had lost consciousness due to extreme exertion. He realized he was going to need help immediately, and that's how our story comes back to the beginning. Rob Hall managed to call for reinforcements over the radio. His assistant left Namba with Beck Weathers, blinded by the altitude, and they began the descent with others who were in the same place. The guide departed with oxygen and water to aid Hall. Neither he nor the person he intended to bring back alive would return. Krakauer, the young journalist who had gone with Hall's group, would say years later that he saw the guide acting erratically and paranoid. On his part, Scott Fisher, without the strength to continue, persuaded his Sherpa to go on without him and go for help. Both groups of climbers were lost, yet united. The other secondary guide from Mountain Madness led his clients along with Yasuko Namba and Beck Weathers from Adventure Consultants. But the strong icy winds and the snowstorm erased the fixed ropes and the descent path, so they were forced to cross a dangerous 20-meter drop. When the storm subsided a bit, the most experienced ones went out in search of help. When they returned to the camp, they were not prepared to carry out a rescue mission. They were exhausted, and due to the poor visibility, they knew that going out would be fatal. However, the Russian Anatoly answered the call of heroism and went out, despite the slim chances of returning alive. He located 3 of the stranded climbers this way. He urged them all not to give up and to continue with him. The chances were not plentiful, but the Russian was sure that he should not give up. With winds of 70 km per hour, strong enough to lift a person, and an extremely low freezing temperature, the outlook was not encouraging at all. If they didn't blink constantly, they ran the risk of their eyes literally freezing. Similarly, exposed skin could freeze instantly. The situation was dire, and 6 people needed help. Rob Hall, his assistant, Doug Hansen, Scott Fisher, Yasuko Namba, and Beck Weathers. On the morning of May 11th, a team found Namba lifeless from freezing. In the snow, they overlooked Beck. However, the man regained consciousness after 22 hours in a hypothermic coma. His nose was ice. He had both hands frozen because he had lost his gloves, and one eye was in the same condition, which made him partially blind. However, nothing stopped him from standing up and pushing the limits of human endurance. He managed to reach the base of Camp 4 stumbling and nearly unconscious. In his book, he would later say that he was driven by the vision of his wife and children, urging him to keep going. The following dawn, Hall radioed in and reported that Doug Hansen and his guide were no longer there. The bodies of both climbers were never found. A few hours later, Hall made a final call. From the pass, Hillary had spent the night at 8,700 meters high and with 70 degrees below zero. After saying goodbye to his wife, his life was fading away as the minutes passed. 2 weeks later, on May 23rd, his body was recovered by the IMAX expedition. Anatoly ascended several times looking for his friend Scott Fisher and finally managed to find his frozen body. With great sorrow, he covered the climber's backpack. His body was never recovered, although a pile of stones marks his grave at the summit as a sign for climbers and a tribute to a legend. After the disaster and tragedy of Everest on May 10, 1996, high-altitude guided commercial expeditions were in the spotlight of criticism, although mountaineering professionals point out that they were led by the best. And they attribute the blame to the error in the weather forecast. Not as accurate as today due to the advancement of technology. However, the expeditions continued. Adventure consultants and Mountain Madness continued to lead guides to the summits of Everest. The only thing that changed were the improvements in safety measures. The tragedy marked a before and after. The number of expert hubs increased with each expedition, like the verification and assurance of not leaving without the fixed ropes established before any ascent. Added to this, a greater accuracy in the weather forecast with expedition teams more synchronized with these agencies. On the other hand, little is said about the expedition of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, which is on the other side of Everest. Also lost 4 members due to the storm that devastated the Adventure Consultants and Mountain Madness expeditions. One of those victims was the legendary Green Boots, who was mummified by the extreme cold, could only be identified by the color of his green boots. During the full season, 12 people died trying to reach the summit, making it the 3rd deadliest on Everest, after the 16 deaths from the avalanche of 2014 and the 18 deaths resulting from avalanches caused by the Nepal earthquake in April of 2015. Krakauer told his truth in the book Into the Air in 1997, where he criticized Bukhariev. In his book The Climb, the Russian defended himself and explained his reasons for his actions. Years later, the journalist had to retract some passages from his book. Beyond the positions and the alleged truths, the survivors are the ones who will carry the suffering they went through in that odyssey to reach the highest peak in the world etched in their skin. Some swore never to return, although others have come back, like Neil Biedelman, who returned and summited the peak in 2011. For Beck Weathers, it was a new beginning of life and he made it clear in an interview. What happened up there made me analyze and reevaluate my life and ask myself how I really wanted to live it. Weathers also wrote about his experience and that bibliographic material was made into a movie in 2015 in the film Everest, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, George Brolin and Jason Clarke. Graham Radcliffe, who climbed the south col of Everest. On May 10, 1996, he documented in A Day to Die for 2011 that the weather reports delivered to the expedition leaders, including Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, before their summit attempts scheduled for May 10th, predicted a major storm developing after May 8th and reaching a peak of intensity on May 11th of 1996. With this, the incompetence of both organizers was somehow highlighted. The competition between companies to be able to summit and gain more prestige could have been an incentive, but the weather conditions were what ended up deciding how each of them would end. Don't you think? Once again, we must take the most concrete conclusion. Nothing can ever stand against the force of nature. That concludes today's video on the Everest tragedy. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and enable notifications. I invite you to leave suggestions about possible similar cases. I'll leave some videos for you to continue the marathon. Without further ado, I bid farewell. I'm Magnum Mephisto, and we'll see each other in the next video. Goodbye, Exploration 10. My first book is now available in all bookstores. I leave the link below for you to get it in physical format and in ebook. Thank you.